Welcome to session 7 of the QPSW Spring Sessions. This one is Building Peace in Britain Today, Freedom from Fear and Harm. My name is Ellis Brooks. I'm the Peace Education Coordinator in QPSW, and with me is Daniel.
Hello, friends.
And Daniel is the Peace and Disarmament Program Manager. Whether you're a Quaker or not, and whether this is the 7th session for you or whether you've just come to this as your first one, you are very welcome. We're going to tell you a little bit about Quaker Peace and Social Witness and the work before we get into the substance of the session and what you can expect from the session. So Quaker Peace and Social Witness, QPSW, is part of Quakers in Britain, which describes itself as a peace church. So we do some of the work on behalf of that church and on behalf of Quakers. And QPSW isn't the only place that does witness for Quakers, but we do as much as we can. There are 21 people on staff in QPSW. In terms of hours, we had up to about 15 people. Working on lots of issues, as you can see, on peace and peace building, on sustainability and climate justice, although those intersect with lots of issues like racism and migration and peace work overseas, things like housing and the criminal justice system. So it covers a lot, and we try to kind of find the connections. And perhaps if you've been to all 7 sessions, you can find the sessions for yourself. This diagram that a lovely colleague in our design team put together gives a sense of the overall witness model behind our vision. So you can see Quaker discernment being the place that sort of disseminates all the work. In terms of my work and Daniel's work, there are certain parts of this diagram that we connect with challenging militarism and violence by the state. With looking at dehumanization, with supporting the peace movement, doing peace education, challenging nuclear disarmament, and seeing the climate crisis as a peace issue as well. So that's sort of how we fit into the overall structure of things. Before I turn to faith and practice, Daniel and I will share a bit of housekeeping with you. You've probably noticed, you probably heard that this session is being recorded. So that's so that we can share it with friends, with everyone who participated afterwards, and it will be sent out in the QPSW newsletter for people who missed it as well. I also just want to remind you, friends, that if you registered, you should have received a care statement, which is just about how we treat each other fairly and respectfully in this session, and seek to see that of God or that of good, if you prefer, in one another. We want it to be a very accessible, inclusive session, so Daniel's going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to begin just with a look at faith and practice. Daniel.
Thank you. So yeah, I'd like to just very briefly set out a spiritual perspective on harm and fear. And there's a quote from Quaker Faith and Practice. I know some will be able to read it, but perhaps not everyone will, so I will read it out loud. So this is what the All Friends Conference discerned 1920. You cannot foster harmony by the apparatus of discord, nor cherish goodwill by the equipment of hate. But it is by harmony and goodwill that human security can be attained. Armaments aim at a security in isolation, but such would at best be utterly precarious and is, as a matter of fact, illusory. The only true safety is the safety of all. And unless your weapon of defense achieves this work or works towards this, it is a source of antagonism and therefore of increased peril. So it is through cooperation and the pursuit of common security and the common good that we can build a peaceful and safe world. A zero-sum or win-lose approach to security is ultimately self-defeating. We need to build a new culture of peace and nonviolence rooted in justice and universal compassion and loving kindness. But thinking about the question of security, I was also reminded of the many spiritual and philosophical reflections on the inevitability of change and risk and adversity. Life has been full of trials and tribulations. So I think it is important to develop moral courage and to seek equanimity in the face of adversity. In the words of the 11th century Persian poet and philosopher Nasir Khusro, we need to make a shield from wisdom, for there is no stronger shield against calamities. I think it is important to bear in mind this insight and to seek to discover our inner resources when we are navigating everyday life, as well as the often uncertain and risky work for justice and peace.
Thanks, Daniel.
Right.
So that sets us up nicely for the rest of the session, and the use of the word safety in that quote will be useful for the next activity. But just to share, friends, where we're going next. So we're going to reflect a bit on what makes us safe or unsafe, and there'll be a bit of interactivity in that section. And we'll spend some time understanding how we can analyze what we hear about security, about what makes us safe or unsafe, so we can have a bit more of a critical lens for that. After those two, we'll have a break, which will be around the halfway point. And then we will think about our vision of what peace building could lead to in Britain, a culture of peace and non-violence. What does that actually mean? And then look at some of the tools that could help us to get there. So to begin with a little bit of an activity. This is an activity from my sort of day-to-day work in peace education. And it's an opportunity to think about the different things that you see either in real life or in the media, and whether they are things that make us safe or unsafe. And we're going to break up into rooms in a moment to look at that question and use these images to do it, but I'll explain what you'll do in the room first, and then I'll explain how you join the rooms. So we've got lots of images here, and you can look at any of them and you might have a straight reaction, oh, that looks safe to me, or that doesn't look safe to me. And it's up to you really to sense that for yourself. What does it mean? For example, if you take the image of the moon in a night sky, you could say, well, in the dark, I don't feel safe. But then you could say, well, the moon, it's a symbol of female power. It could light the way. So it actually makes me feel safe. You could take an image like this and say, well, it looks like agriculture, it looks like the food supply. That's an essential need for all of us. So that makes me feel safe to know that's working. Or you might look at the machine involved and say, that looks a bit intensive. Maybe it's monoculture farming. Maybe it's not that good for the environment. So maybe it doesn't make you feel safe. It's sort of up to you to kind of interpret the image and what it might mean to you. And you can see there's lots to choose from. During the activity, you won't have time to look at all of these pictures. It is a choice which ones you're drawn to and which ones you'd like to talk about. To have that conversation, we're going to go into small breakout rooms. I'm going to say at the beginning, if you don't want to go into the breakout room, if you don't want to kind of be fiddling with technology and moving things on the screen, then don't go into a breakout room. Just don't click the button, stay with me, and we'll have that conversation as a whole group together. But I think it's nice for you to have a chance to talk to one another if you have the time. So Phil is posting this link to interactive versions in the chat, and that'll give you a list of what are called Jamboards. I'll show you a Jamboard on my screen now. So it's the same images, but this one you can interact with when you go into the link. So you can take an image and you can drag it to say that's safe or that's unsafe. So in your group, you can have that up on the screen to discuss. You can move any of the images. More than one person can do it using the link. Okay, so if you're still with me at this point, I'm assuming you'd like to stay in the main room and we can discuss these together. If there is an image that I'm sharing that you'd like to kind of comment on, whether it makes you feel safe or unsafe, could you wave at me on your video, or you can also use the hands up button. Let's have a look at Anne. Tell us why you chose that one.
Because they've got guns. And I think people are always out of control when they're holding guns.
Interesting. So it sounds like that would make you feel unsafe then.
Oh, definitely. I wouldn't think I was being protected, no.
Yes, it's an interesting one. That's exactly the justification we would have, isn't it? We would hear about that. I've done this activity in schools and done it with a mixture of young Black people and young white people and a very diverse room. And it tends to be the young Black people who feel most unsafe with an image like this. And the young white people tend to be more like, yeah, they're probably there to protect us.
Oh, really?
I mean, I don't claim to have a comprehensive sense, but I've definitely noted that kind of distinction when I've been talking.
That's disturbing, isn't it, really?
Is there someone else who would like to talk about one of these images?
Yeah, hi, Alice. I'm just intrigued at the image in F. I don't know what it is until you actually highlight it. Yeah, right.
So it's a CCTV camera.
Ah, right. I don't know what it was. Yeah. Oh, this is a funny one, isn't it? Because in some respects, it makes me feel safe. And that anybody exhibiting antisocial behaviour will be highlighted and recorded. But it also intrudes on my privacy as well, which makes me feel unsafe. So it's a bit of a dichotomy, really. I think generally it makes me feel safer when I see it. When I see one in a shop or somewhere, and I know that if people are going to be antisocial, they will be recorded and penalised. Yeah, so I think on balance, it makes me feel safe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think we hear that debate kind of writ large.
It's divisive.
Go ahead.
Because it's okay. We think it's okay for other people to be filmed, but not us, because, you know, we're not going to be doing anything. So it's divisive, isn't it?
It certainly had divisive consequences in Birmingham in the early days of the Prevent strategy against terrorism in the Labour years. They used money to put lots more security cameras in Muslim areas of Birmingham, and there was a massive backlash against that, and you can understand why, because it's treating different communities differently, suspecting them differently, and the question goes back to you know, thousands of years ago with the Plato asking, are we only moral when people are watching? Does our behavior change when we are seen or not seen? So it's not a new dilemma, that one. I think we might have time before the groups close for one more. Does anyone want to raise one? Ruth, which one would you like?
I heard a talk about surveillance equipment, and it was being developed in Israel because it was tested on people, you can imagine that, and it was being sold to other big markets at the end of the Silk Belt Road. So whenever I see something, I look at it and I think, what are the business interests behind the rollout of these things? The money. Because my friend, my very good friend, said, what a boring job to watch all this CCTV footage. What an awful job. He said that about 20 years ago. I mean, what a job. So I don't think that's where my pennies should be put.
Yeah, you raise a very interesting question about the what happens when we follow the money. For example, there are companies like Serco and G4S who do security in this country. They do security overseas, including in Israel. Certainly in the case of G4S. And yeah, you're right that Israel markets its weapons around the world to other nations, partly premised on, we've tested this, we've used them for real. There's a good documentary, I think it's called The Lab, about that, and the lab in that analogy is Gaza, the Gaza Strip, where the weapons are often deployed.
Sorry, Alice, which image was Ruth talking about just now? I thought we had to choose.
Was there a particular image you were thinking of, Ruth, or just the general
The
question?
CCTV surveillance, or security, or I mean, it's marketing ploy for a very, very lucrative business. Just see the billions the contracts are worth.
I understand that one. Which image you're talking about? Yeah.
I like.
Yeah, it's interesting as well because I'm
sure the little lamb feels.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sure the little lamb.
the little lamb.
And as we're supposed to be all
that makes me feel quite safe.
As we're all interconnected. I am the lamb, and the lamb is me, and makes me feel unsafe thinking about the lamb.
Oh, interesting. The lamb is a new addition for the. I've never used the lamb image before, so it's interesting that it had that response from you, Barbara. Thank you. Yeah, I think because I partly put it in there because it might conjure thoughts about the food industry. Yeah. The other groups are just coming back in another 40 seconds or so. So people will be popping up in the room. So to sort of sum this up a little bit, you all had different reactions, I imagine, to the images, making you feel safe or unsafe. And that goes to the root of what we mean by security, because security actually comes from Latin se cura, which means without care. And by care, they mean worry, anxiety. So if you're secure, you're not afraid. But that's a subjective idea, whether you're afraid or not. So we have to balance this tension between the objective reality of threats in the world. Are terrorists a threat? Do I need to worry about that? And how do we evaluate that? Versus the fact that we're animals who sometimes get afraid, and that can be a valid experience. Like, I don't think it's illegitimate for a young Black person to be afraid of the police at times. So we need to sort of hold that tension when we ask about what makes us safe. The human experience and the objective reality. But to talk about it in terms of policy, in terms of peace building, we need to kind of try and agree actually what objective changes we want. Daniel.
Right, so I will now look at some of the narratives and fallacies that inform the prevailing approaches to security, and I will outline some of the main features of militarist ideology and practice, as well as some of the major security threats we face. This brief overview will indicate why militarism isn't helping with those threats and is in fact making them much, much worse. So looking first at militarist ideology versus reality, we have been exposed to decades of propaganda about supposedly humanitarian military interventions and ethical foreign policy. But in the last 100 years and more, for centuries, in fact, there has not been a single year in which Britain has not been at war somewhere on earth. So the UK is a permanent war state, and UK military interventions have not been driven by humanitarian concerns, but primarily by narrow geopolitical and economic interests. They have been humanitarian catastrophes. Tragically, the invasion of Iraq alone has resulted in over 1 million people dying, and millions of people have been displaced. The amount of human and non-human animal suffering is, of course, unquantifiable. All of the UK interventions during the so-called war on terror have effectively led to the dismemberment of the countries that were invaded, an increase in insecurity, brutality, and suffering. The fact that the UK is the second largest seller of weapons in the world also belies the claims about the UK's supposedly ethical foreign policy. The UK sells arms to some of the most repressive regimes on earth, including Saudi Arabia, which has been bombing Yemen for 6 years with the UK's assistance, leading to what the UN has described as the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world. At the end of last year, the UN estimated that the war has led to over 230,000 people dying, including thousands of children, many of them by starving to death. This is a picture of a child in Yemen looking at the rubbles after a bombing raid. Underlying militarist ideology and militarist actions is this belief that might is right and that violence works. But as Hannah Arendt pointed out, the practice of violence changes the world, but the most probable change is to a more violent world. And we have a great deal of historical experience as well as of academic research, which have firmly established that nonviolent action is far more conducive to achieving democratization and progressive change in the direction of creating more peaceful and humane societies. But militarist ideology serves to conceal certain material interests on which militarism is founded. This includes the pursuit of geopolitical dominance, the pursuit of power and profits for the military-industrial complex, including through the plundering of resources and the breaking open of new markets, as we've seen in Iraq and elsewhere. The military establishment covers up these kinds of self-regarding pursuits through the promotion of nationalism and the glorification of the military, for example, through Armed Forces Day, the militarist marking of remembrance, the introduction of army cadets in schools, and so on. But it neglects the welfare of soldiers and of veterans. Fundamental to militarism is the ideology and practice of othering, often through a racist discourse. And those who are considered to be somehow different, not a part of the in-group, are deemed to be of less value, and their rights and dignity are not seen to be as important. And the practice of treating the other as the enemy reinforces the prevailing us and them win-lose approach to security. In the militarist mindset, there is little understanding of the need to pursue common security through cooperation and peace building. Next slide, please. So let's briefly look at only a few of the major security threats that we face, and let's consider some of the ways in which they're related to militarism. These include the threat of pandemics, the neglect for people's other health needs, the climate and ecological crisis, and the threat of military confrontations. Next slide. So looking first at the pandemic, successive national security risk assessments identified pandemics as a tier 1 threat. But the UK, in common with other parts of the world, was very unprepared for it. And this lack of preparation has contributed to the deaths of tens of thousands of people in the UK alone. The governments are always very committed to preparing for war and militarist violence, but have tended to ignore people's real well-being and security needs. And not everyone was left in the same boat, with people in lower class positions, as well as some ethnic minorities and other especially marginalized groups, often bearing the brunt of the crisis. We are also faced with the continuing threat of new zoonotic diseases and pandemics, which is another reason why the Quaker understanding about the unity of creation is so important. As it is beautifully said in Quaker faith practice, we should show a loving consideration to all creatures and a reverence for life. We need to move beyond the notion that might is right, which militarism shares with other violent ideologies. And it is only by extending the call of compassion to all sentient suffering beings that we can create a culture of peace and nonviolence. Can I have the next? So looking at the problem of neglect for people's other health needs, the chronic underfunding of the NHS has clearly been a major problem. And in fact, according to a study published in the British Medical Journal, 120,000 people may have died between 2010 and 17 in England alone due to cuts to healthcare and social care budgets. 120,000 avoidable deaths due to these cuts. Yet at the same time, the government was committing itself to the replacement of Trident nuclear weapons at a cost of at least £205 billion, according to one conservative estimate. Furthermore, around 40,000 people die each year in the UK due to air pollution. This is further evidence of the neglect for people's real health and security needs. And thousands of rough sleepers and many others are not having the basic health and well-being needs met, which actually includes millions of people, including many children, who are going hungry in one of the richest countries in the world. The UK government has also announced it will massively cut aid to some of the poorest people in the world. Next. And then there is the climate and ecological crisis, with the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warning that we have less than 10 years left for deep decarbonization to avert runoff climate change. We're also witnessing the rapid and perilous decline of biodiversity, which is the result of the immense human violence against other beings and the rest of the natural world. And military activity contributes to the devastation of the environment. UK military activity is equivalent to greenhouse gas emissions from 6 million cars, according to a recent study. And the government has such skewed priorities. The military budget is set to increase by £24 billion over the next 4 years. Average annual government spending plan for the period of 2021 to 25 is 47 billion for the military and just 6 billion for reducing UK carbon emissions. This is extremely alarming considering the profound ecological crisis we are in. Lastly, I want to outline the increasing threat of military confrontations. So a new arms race is raging. It is encompassing autonomous weapon systems, biological weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, cyber warfare, hypersonic missiles, directed energy weapons, and other increasingly dystopian weapons. The Chief of Defense Staff recently said that the British Army might have 30,000 robot soldiers by the 2030s. And the government has recently announced it will increase the number of nuclear warheads by 44%. In the past, the world was dominated by two superpowers with similar nuclear arsenals and similar nuclear doctrines. But the end of the bipolar division of the world has resulted in a more crowded geopolitical space with a greater number of nuclear weapon states and greater differences in nuclear arsenals and nuclear doctrines, which has added to the volatility of the situation. New nuclear weapon doctrines and technologies are emerging, such as the so-called low-yield and tactical nuclear weapons. They increase the scope for the use of nuclear weapons, with some military strategists openly talking about the possibility of a winnable nuclear war. There is also increased military deployment to other parts of the world, including the South China Sea, and so on and so on. The renowned peace scholar Paul Rogers has written about a concept which he called lidism, by which he was referring to the prevailing practice of seeking to control security threats by military means instead of addressing their root causes, which is analogous to attempting to keep the lid on a cooking pot instead of turning down the heat, which we know to be ultimately self-defeating, as is militarism. Pursuing security through military means leads to rights violations, and it causes insecurity by reinforcing militarism. And there is no guarantee that the arms race won't enable one of the great powers to acquire an unassailable military advantage, which it may then be tempted to make use of. Next. I wanted to read to you a couple of sentences from a powerful statement by the European Nuclear Disarmament Initiative, which I think powerfully describes the peril that inheres in the contemporary arms race. At what point large-scale computer hacking operation spill over into a hot war? How much surveillance, how many drones, how many robotic weapons can be deployed before critical mass is reached? How many things must go wrong, and in what sequence before these embodiments of what Mike Cooley terms our delinquent genius might bring an end to us all? So we need to demilitarize for life, because peace and security cannot be achieved through violence, which makes the world a more dangerous and brutal place. We need to establish peaceable structures that pursue common security. And instead of squandering vast amounts of resources each year on war and militarism, we should be investing in creative peacemaking and the construction of a peaceful green economy. As peacemakers and engaged citizens, we are called to raise awareness about this. The ruling paradigm has a completely wrong view of security and has pushed us into the many intertwining crises which we are now living through. There is no technological fix that would allow us to resolve the current security threats related to militarism. There are no material solutions for spiritual problems. We need to rebuild society on different foundations. putting principles over profits and cooperation and kindness over brutality and killing. A little later, we will briefly look at some of the ways in which we can go about developing effective strategies for deep transformative change. Thank you, friends.
Thank you, Daniel. A lot to think about in that. That's why, friends, I'm very glad not to be doing this workshop alone, because Daniel gives a level of rigor and analysis to these issues, which I certainly couldn't. But before we have a break, I will do something called a Mentimeter with a simple question for you, which is, what is it then that does make us safe? You might draw some ideas from what Daniel has just shared. And on the screen, I think the results should start to appear as we find out. Here they come. So we see people have talked about some quite concrete things like housing, shelter. Someone has talked about women and power, so noting the kind of gender inequalities we're still living with. People talking about each other, talking about friendship, so that kind of needing to connect with each other, neighborliness on that theme as well. Mm-hmm. Interesting that community has come out so high as well. Material needs need to be fulfilled as well. So we actually have a strong idea of things that do make us secure. And I can see we've noted police there. So there's not a sense from everyone here that the police are sort of on one side of that security question. So in the second half, we'll build on that question of what does make us secure and how can we build a culture of peace in Britain. Okay, to resume then, friends, Daniel has already given you some very helpful sort of critical tools to deconstruct the fallacies, the narratives that perpetuate a sort of current security narrative, perhaps rooted a lot in fear and not in true security. And from these words in this word cloud, we have a bit of a sense of the things that we do think security could be built upon. So I'll stop sharing here for a moment, and I'm going to invite you to, with me, just deepen that that visioning of what a culture of peace and nonviolence would look like in Britain. So for you to do this thinking, I just invite you just to settle in your chair, make sure you're comfortable. Notice your feet on the floor, where your hands are resting. Perhaps just notice your breathing now. And if you like, while I'm asking you a few questions and you want to envision the answers, close your eyes. And I don't mind if your camera is off for this as well. So just notice that breathing. The first question: if we had a culture of peace and nonviolence, what would you notice right now in your own body and mind? Next question. If we had a culture of peace and nonviolence, what would you notice within your own family or household, your immediate closest relationships? And if we had that culture of peace and nonviolence, what about the next level out? What would you notice in your community or your communities, your workplace, your faith community, other groups that you're part of? How would you see that peace and non-violence? What about the relationship between your community and other communities? And continuing to radiate outwards, we had a culture of peace and non-violence. What would you notice at a national level about what the state does? And what about that international level? The relationship between nations and the people in them on a global level. And what would you notice in our relationship with the environment and nature if we had a culture of peace and non-violence? And finally, I invite you just to return your mind to your body now and your own presence, your own experience. The thoughts that you just had there for you alone, but perhaps they will help tee up the next section where Daniel is going to talk a bit about the actual concrete tools that we can use together to build on that vision that you have in your heart. One framing that we find useful when doing that is positive peace. So we often talk about peace as simply the absence of violence, of the absence of war or interpersonal violence, but actually, as I'm sure a lot of the things that you envisioned were actually about positive peace, about justice across our society. So from that to action, over to you, Daniel.
Right, friends, from vision to action. Yeah, so how do we work for this culture of peace? For our session, I'd like to share a few of the tools which we can use to develop concrete strategies for constructing peace-building alliances and campaigns and a grassroots movement for positive peace. And in order to be able to turn the tide of history in the direction of justice and peace, we need to be gentle as doves, but also wise as serpents, as one very prominent peacemaker and community organizer put it long ago. I'm referring to Jesus here, of course. A crucial aspect of that wise and skillful approach to bringing about positive, radical change is to identify the sources of power in society and ways of increasing people power through enlightened, non-violent grassroots movements. Next slide. So the first tool I want to show to you is called Pillars of Power. And here we have an inverted pyramid. By way of explaining this diagram, I need to know that there are two basic ways of thinking about power. One view simply sees society being organized as a hierarchical pyramid with powerful elites at the top and a relatively powerless, broad population at the bottom. And unfortunately, there is a great deal of truth in that basic understanding. But this view is mistaken when it assumes that this pyramid of power can just sit on its point. Just as a pyramid object in the material world cannot sit on its point, so the pyramid of power cannot be based on its tip. It requires props or pillars, and in this picture, they're represented by these red lines. The pyramid of power is unsustainable without these various pillars propping it up, either actively or through their passivity and obedience. So this is a different, more accurate way of looking at power. Power ultimately resides with the people. The power of the rulers is largely based on the consent and the passive obedience or acquiescence of the governed. The first perspective, which assumes that the broad population is powerless, also assumes that social change can only be achieved by appealing to the power holders to change their policies through the established elite-controlled channels and institutions. By contrast, the perspective which understands that power is based on many pillars of support also understands that achieving deep social change is therefore based on raising public awareness, transforming popular consciousness, and activating citizens through alliance building and grassroots movement building in order to challenge the elites to create non-violent counterpower. So the broad population needs to discover its own power, people power, in order to build a society based on justice, peace, and non-violence. People need to become active participants in public life. They need to become protagonists of social change. And power needs to shift from the elites to new grassroots networks and alliances. This is a crucial point. History has shown us that building alliances is crucial for the growth and success of social movements. So while we may need to weaken some of the pillars that support the existing structures of power, often progressive change is about pulling the pillars in our direction, reaching out to new constituencies, developing new alliances with various elements of civil society. This is how Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and the movements they led managed to change history. So when we are mapping the pillars which prop up a particular set of policies or a particular system of oppression, we can start thinking about opportunities to expand the alliance for justice and peace. The social actors listed in this diagram are just some of the major constituencies we can either challenge or we can seek them into our movements and campaigns, which is often better. In so doing, we can start dissecting and deconstructing the structures of domination and oppression. And of course, when mapping the pillars of power, we would need to go into much more detail than this diagram shows. So for example, armed forces here can be a shorthand for officers as well as soldiers, veterans, perhaps also military families, and so on. Also, for example, there are, of course, many types of civil society groups and organizations, from various community groups to NGOs and think tanks, not all of which are open to supporting progressive causes. But building a powerful movement for change requires us to think about possibilities to create a critical mass and a system of coalitions and alliances for progressive change. Can I have the next slide, please? So what we need is peacemaking from below, grassroots movement building that works to expand the circles of peace and non-violence. This image here points to the fact that we tend to already have various opportunities to network and to establish new connections in our work for justice and peace. Friends, work colleagues, members of a community group we are involved in, and so on. So when developing networks and campaigns in a local setting, for example, perhaps there is another faith group or a local Amnesty International group whose members may be interested in supporting your campaign. Similarly, you could think about whether you already know or could approach a representative of a trades council who may be able to join you or assist you in your peace work. So trades councils are the territorial, often activist federations of local trade unionists, and they exist all over the country. I know that in various places, trades councils have even offered material support to the anti-war movement. There may also be an anti-austerity or a health campaign group in your area which shares your concerns about the government's skewed priorities in favor of militarism. So it may be possible to find common ground and to engage in united action in relation to the shared concerns. And there are, of course, many such examples of possibilities for alliance building when we approach movement organizing strategically and methodically. So we need to carefully map and think about who our allies may be. Next slide, please. This tool, the spectrum of allies, can also help us to think about our intended audiences and constituencies for our organizing work. Again, helping us to identify who we can work with and who we need to win over or at least influence sufficiently so that they do not oppose our campaign. When using this tool, we can insert in the slices the groups or constituencies which we think belong there, and it can help us to think about ways in which we should interact with them. We need to identify who our active allies are and how we can better connect with them and increase our level of organization and coordination. Passive allies might be more likely to give some lower level forms of support first, for example, by using an online lobbying tool to lobby their local MP, or perhaps sharing our messages on social media. And these are the people we should try to turn into active allies. So we try to move people and groups in our direction, but this model does not focus on trying to win over those who are on the opposite end of the spectrum, such as militarist MPs. They may shift towards our positions, this may happen, but it is often much likelier that a policy shift will be achieved if there is a broad critical mass of people non-violently challenging the power holders or even taking away their power. When we use this model, we can become much more effective in choosing strategies and tactics. We can look at the diagram and these filled in pie slices and ask, which slice do we want to reach out to in our next action, and assist the people in it to move one step towards us. So in this way, we can identify multiple opportunities for movement growth. We can design tactics that are best suited to the group or social constituency that we're trying to influence. Bearing in mind two things. Firstly, we need to think about their own enlightened self-interest and speak to that, but also connect this to wider ethical principles, a sense of communal justice and the public interest. And there are various ways of trying to help others in our communities become open to new light. We need to think about these and educate ourselves about the most fruitful approaches to engaging with and encountering others in our work for progressive change. What tends to be needed is a combination of rational and emotional appeals. Paul's epistle to the Colossians contains thoughts that can still help us to become true peacemakers. We should clothe ourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, which is to say that through our actions, we should strive to model the kind of society we wish to bring about. And we can do this by, among other things, cultivating kindness and decentering ourselves in the work for justice and peace. We need to think how we can be of service in our communities and how we can broaden the circle of compassion and care and solidarity. And in so doing, we can also apply our spiritual insights and the various findings of positive and peace psychology. So for example, researchers have found something that corresponds to our intuition, which is that a sense of gratitude tends to lead to a non-violent disposition. So engaging in charitable activity and giving service to our community can also help to open people's hearts and minds to our message. And so as I've pointed out, we are most powerless when we are made to believe that we are powerless. Greta Thunberg has remarked that hope comes from action, or as Gandhi put it, best effort is best victory. Peacemaking is a spiritual endeavor that, as Gandhi, King, and other historic peacemakers have emphasized, requires moral courage and tenacity and fortitude. So friends, we need to cultivate bravery and steadfastness in the work for justice and peace. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Daniel. You explained that really clearly. So the penny dropped for me about something that I hadn't kind of connected before, which was that you said about the pillars of power and being able to tilt them towards ourselves. And that's exactly what the spectrum of allies does. You can tilt people in your direction. I've seen those tools many times before. I never made that connection, so thank you. We are going to move on now to a bit of time for you to discuss in breakout rooms what you have heard and how you can make use of it. So I'm sharing screen again. So in your breakout room, this is sort of your responsibility at this stage. What action can you take? What action do you want to take? You'll be in quite a small group again of 3 or 4 people, and we'd ask you to agree based on the visioning you've done, based on the things you've heard, what area of peace building you'd want to focus on, because you can't do it all. So would you focus on racism, on tackling militarism, on fracking, and on deportations? Perhaps someone in your group has arrived with a real concern that they'd like to explore, or perhaps you'll just agree that between you, but try not to spend too long going over the issues, because it's more like practicing this way of thinking about our action. Then the main thing we'd like you to do is discuss how you could use the tools and analysis to build a culture of peace. So if you choose militarism, then what are the pillars of power holding that up, and how could you affect them? And who would your allies be? Who would those networks be that Daniel was talking about? You'll have about 10 minutes in these breakout groups to explore those questions. We won't have, friends, lots of times for feedback. So again, the conversation you have is your responsibility, and we hope it's the conversation you were meant to have, and the group you were meant to be with. If you have any troubles in your group, then you can leave the group by simply pressing the leave button and come back to our main space here. And we'd be happy to talk to you here as well. As we won't have time for like detailed feedback, we'll use another Mentimeter afterwards, where people can type some of the actions that they would plan to take forward to build that culture of peace and non-violence in Britain. So we will capture it and we can email it to you afterwards. So if you are taking notes on the computer, it would be copy and pastable. But however you want to share that afterwards will be up to you. So again, small breakout group, agree the kind of area of peace building you want to focus on, and then how could you use the tools that you've heard to actually take action and build that culture of peace. Welcome back, friends. Lovely to see you, and I hope you enjoyed that time spent together. It's a bit of a mystery to Daniel and I what you were actually discussing, but hopefully it was fruitful. To capture it a little bit, I'm sharing the same link as we had before in the chat, but it will be a different question this time for the Mentimeter, and you can type a bit more. So I'll pause for that. If we're getting some in. Yeah, I think that's something we've been talking a lot in QPSW about, what kind of meaningful connection with people who are marginalized, because obviously if people are marginalized, it can be harder for them to connect to others, and for it not to be a lot of work to do that. So how we can do that without kind of dominating them or co-opting them. And yes, conversations, thinking about racism in the local media, that's a very interesting point. Alliances across schools and colleges. Promote peace education in schools, yay, I like it. Teachers as allies is very key to that. Supporting asylum seekers. Yeah, that's interesting, because we talked a lot about the macro migration system, but yeah, there's lots popping up now, friends, thank you. So I think there's going to be a lot of action flowing out of this, so thank you for your engagement with that, friends. We are moving towards a close though now, with that sort of promise to yourselves that there is action that you can take. So as we do that, Daniel and I would like to share a few things that could also help with that.
Right, so my colleagues in the Peace Education program have developed many brilliant resources for use in schools and beyond, and you can find them on the website of Quakers in Britain. And mention GCOMS as well now, as QPSW is also actively involved in the Global Campaign on Military Spending UK, which is a broad alliance that is raising awareness about the many humanitarian and other consequences of UK government's commitment to militarism. And besides QPSW, other friends such as the Northern Friends Peace Board and Huddersfield Quakers are also supporting organizations. So perhaps your local meeting could affiliate to it as well. I will post the link to it in the chat. Thank you. Over to you, Ellis.
Thanks, Daniel. And there's a resource called Building Peace Together from the Quaker Council of European Affairs. If you type Building Peace Together Quaker in a search engine, you'll get it. It's quite an amazing resource by our friends based in Brussels about the many different tools that we can use in peace building. Sometimes that's framed as something that you do in conflict-affected parts of the world, but I think they're very applicable in Britain, not least because British society is itself conflict affected in various ways. So I think that's certainly worth checking out. And another resource from a very learned individual called Daniel Jakopovich, called Revolutionary Peacemaking, Writings for a Culture of Peace and Nonviolence, which is available from the Quaker Centre bookshop. And it's an amazingly detailed and thorough read about the kinds of things that we've been talking about today, but going into a lot more depth. So check it out. As we close off today, friends, a few other things. If you want to stay connected with our work, then check out the newsletter, Quaker Faith in Action. It's an email that Phil actually puts together for us. So you can subscribe to that with the link that will go into the chat. You can also follow British Quakers, but also me and my colleague Isabel Cartwright, who do the peace education work on Twitter, Peace Edu Quaker on Twitter, or Daniel's work on militarism, on the arms trade, on nuclear weapons, on disarmament, on Disarm Quaker. I also would invite you to uphold the work that QPSW is doing, the kind of things that I hope you've had a taste of from today and from the other 6 sessions. We've offered these sessions for free as a way for you to engage friends. So if it's something that you'd like to support, we'd invite you to donate to help us carry on working with and on behalf of Quakers in Britain to bring about that culture of peace and nonviolence in the world, and the other things that QPSW works on. It might also feel like you want to do that as part of the Quaker community by offering service. Some amazing Quakers, including some who are with us today, support the discernment of our work, thinking about like our priorities and the issues. So you could serve on a committee doing that, or with other Quaker organisations. And we've also got a social change toolkit, which you can download from the website, which is really handy for deepening this kind of thing and just sort of saying, well, what are the resources? What are the tools that we need? And finally, or almost finally, I should say, these sessions are something we'd like to learn from as well. So there's been a different evaluation for each one. Dan and I will read all the evaluation data that comes in from this. So that's the link for your browser. Again, it's being posted in the chat. Whether you fill it in now or when you get an email afterwards, we'd really welcome your thoughts on what your takeaways were from this session. Also to remind you, it's been recorded, and that recording will be available afterwards if there's anything that you missed or would like to ask about. And with that, friends, we're just over time. If you have another moment or two, I'm just going to invite my colleague Suzanne Ishmael, who's joined us, just because we realise this is the last session of the QPSW Spring Sessions, so there might be a few quick messages.
Thank you, Ellis. And good evening, friends. Thank you very much, and I'll try not to keep you too much longer. As Ellis says, my name's Suzanne Ismail, and I've been part of the staff team who has been planning this series of workshops. And I can see from the faces on the screen that quite a few of you have been at quite a lot of the workshops. So whether you have been at all 7 or whether this is your first one, thank you so much for joining the QPSW staff team on this journey. I hope that whatever you've been part of, you've learnt something new, and that we've really whetted your appetite for finding out more about what QPSW is doing with and for you. And please do share what you've learned with other friends in your Quaker communities. We'd really, really appreciate that. In terms of what happens next, as Ellis says, all the recordings are going to be sent out to participants later. We'll also send them out in our emails. I also wanted to just say we've been putting on this series in very unusual times, and it's the second year we've done it. We normally have a big in-person conference in Derbyshire in the spring. Some of you I know have been to it. We haven't quite made a decision about what we're going to do next year, and it'll probably be a bit uncertain for some time for obvious reasons. But if you have any views on that, I do use the evaluation forms for that as well, because it will help us in deciding what to do next. And I suppose really just to say, you know, I've been part of the planning team for this work, but I've not been doing very much of the delivery. So I feel like I'm in quite a privileged position, and I think it's probably okay for me to say I think all of the sessions have been great, and just to say thank you so much to the colleagues who've done all the hard work, really, to Phil, Ellis and Daniel for today. And I think when I counted up the names, there were 16 other people that were involved, and I won't name them all because we'll be here for a very long time, but well done team, thank you very much. And finally, as usual, we're going to keep this call open for half an hour or so after the end of the session, in case there's conversations you want to finish off, or you want to swap contact details, or whatever it is you want to do. But before that, I'd just like to invite you to join me for a few moments to reflect in quiet on what we've heard today, what we've heard through the rest of the series. So yes, if you would like to join me in that, and if you need to slip away, of course, do so. But if not, once we've had some quiet, the floor will be back open again for you to carry on connections and make some conversation.